Chapter 6. A man of solitude and Sabbath. And he said to them, Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Mark 6:31. Back in the early 2000s, my wife and I served under a pastor on the East Coast, a man whose presence alone carried a certain quiet steadiness, the kind that made you breathe easier just being around him. It was there, in that slower-paced, deeply relational environment, that I learned one of the most important leadership lessons of my ministry life: the lesson of rest. Or should I say, Sabbath? Before that season, rest wasn't something I valued. I worked under a different pastor back then, a well-meaning leader whose philosophy of ministry was summed up in one statement he repeated often: I'd rather burn out than rust out. For a young, passionate minister like me, that sounded heroic, noble, spiritual even. I believed that exhaustion was the badge of true devotion, that sleepless nights and long hours were signs of spiritual strength, that the harder I pushed, the more God was pleased. Only later did I realize how deeply unhealthy that mindset was. Under that leadership, we often worked long hours, juggling ministry responsibilities with barely enough strength to get through the day. We lived in a constant tension between calling and collapse. Looking back now, I can see how close we often were to the edge, how weariness seeped into our spirits, our conversations, even our marriages. But at the time, I didn't recognize it. When that's all you've known, you assume it's normal. So when God moved us to the East Coast, I was still carrying that same workaholic mentality. I believed rest was a luxury. Sabbath was optional. Solitude was something for monks in stone monasteries, not for pastors with vision and urgency. I wore busyness like a badge of honor. Until one day, everything started to change. The pastor we served under would often ask in his gentle southern drawl, Have you rested this week? And I, so accustomed to the grind, so conditioned to measure my worth by my production, gave the same answer every time. I will. I still have a lot to do. I'll never forget his response the day God used him to reshape my understanding of spiritual health. He walked over to where I sat, buried in paperwork, sermon notes, and ministry agendas, with that familiar warm smile, the kind that made you feel like everything was going to be all right. He sat down beside me and said, I want you and Rose and little Jasmine to come with us to the lake. I've got a boat, and I want to take you on the water. And then with that unmistakable Andy Griffith southern drawl, he leaned back, put his hat on, and said, And I'm not taking no for an answer. I tried to protest. I tried to insist that I needed to stay and finish things. I tried to tell him how much work I had left. He just smiled, shook his head, and said in his strong southern tone, Son, that's exactly why you need to come. And so, reluctantly, off we went. The lake day that changed everything. It ended up being one of the most peaceful, joy-filled days I had experienced in a long time. The sun shimmered on the lake like diamonds scattered across the surface. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and water. We spent the day kneeboarding, laughing until our stomachs hurt, and eating hoagie sandwiches on the boat while the gentle rocking of the water lulled us into a rare moment of calm. Rose relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Little Jasmine squealed with delight every time the boat picked up speed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I barely recognized anymore. Peace. Not the I finally finished everything piece. Not the I earned this break piece. Not the I deserve a day off piece. It was the peace of simply being present, being still, being human. On the way home, our wives chatted in the back seats while the pastor drove. There was a moment of quiet, and he glanced over at me thoughtfully. Then he said words that burned into my heart and never left. I don't know what your dad taught you, and I don't mean any disrespect to your father. But son, you need to learn to take time to reset. It was gentle, it was loving, it was correction without condemnation. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. I sat there in the passenger seat staring out at the passing trees, realizing for the first time how deeply I had equated busyness with value. Somewhere along the way, I had begun to believe that rest was a sign of weakness. That slowing down meant losing momentum. That if I didn't work harder than everyone else, I wasn't being faithful. But that day, that simple invitation to the lake showed me something profound. Rest is not unspiritual. Rest is obedience. The war within, struggling to rest. I wish I could tell you I immediately embraced Sabbath after that. I wish I could say that one boat ride cured me of my unhealthy mindset. But the truth is, even after that experience, I often struggled to rest. The old habits ran deep. There were seasons when I pushed past exhaustion, times when I poured out more than I had, days when I convinced myself that just one more meeting or just one more sermon prep wouldn't hurt. But slowly, over years, the lesson began to sink in. God doesn't reward burnout. God doesn't applaud exhaustion. God never asked us to sacrifice our emotional, spiritual, and physical health on the altar of ministry. Still, even with that revelation, I wasn't always faithful to practice it. And then came the sabbatical that saved us. A few years ago, after 20 years of ministry, my wife and I took a much-needed sabbatical. It was harder than I expected, much harder. Taking 2 months away from the ministry we had built with blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice felt almost impossible. 2 months of not coming to work. 2 months of not leading ministry. 2 months of sleeping in. 2 months of not preaching. 2 months of not stepping into the building that had become our spiritual home. The first week, I paced like a man lost in his own house. Every fiber of my being wanted to check on things, wanted to make sure the services were going well, wanted to know if things were being handled correctly, wanted to make sure the church would survive without me, which in hindsight reveals how much of my identity had become tangled up in being needed. I would sneak onto YouTube and watch the live stream of our services when my wife wasn't looking. One evening, she caught me watching and said the most loving correction a wife could give. If you're watching, you're not resting, you're supposed to be resting. I sighed, reluctantly closed the laptop, and went to sulk in the living room like a scolded teenager. But she was right. My body was away from church, but my mind wasn't. My schedule was empty, but my soul wasn't still. It took time, days of decompressing, weeks of slowing down, before I finally began to rest. Not physically, spiritually. I started waking up without rushing, reading without preparing a sermon, praying without planning a message, sitting in silence without needing to produce something for God. Slowly, solitude began to heal the parts of me I didn't even know were bruised. What I didn't understand then, but I see clearly now, is that sabbatical and solitude are not luxuries for leaders. They are essential spiritual disciplines. Sabbatical is not a vacation. Solitude is not isolation. Rest is not laziness. Rest is worship. Solitude is intimacy. Sabbath is obedience. The theology of rest, why God commands it. The word sabbatical comes from the Hebrew word Sabbath, to cease, to stop, to rest. In Scripture, the Sabbath is not optional. It is sacred, set apart, holy. God didn't suggest rest, He commanded it. And here's what stunned me as I studied it. Adam's first full day of existence was a Sabbath. Think about that. Adam didn't start life with productivity. He didn't begin with labor. He didn't begin with achievement. He began with rest. God was teaching him and us and something profound. Your value begins with being, not doing. Your worth flows from identity, not productivity. Your life begins with God's presence, not your performance. Solitude carries the same spiritual weight. Solitude doesn't mean loneliness, it means being alone with God. Scripture says Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Luke 5:16. Jesus, the Savior of the world, had to withdraw. If anyone could justify constant busyness, it was him. But even he refused to let ministry replace intimacy. He would step away from crowds, from needs, from disciples, from pressure. Why? Because spiritual strength comes from solitude, not in spite of it. And if Jesus practiced it, who am I to neglect it? Coming to terms with rest. Looking back, I realized that the seasons when I didn't rest were the seasons when I made the poorest decisions. Emotional decisions, impulsive decisions, fear-based decisions, exhausted decisions, pride-driven decisions. Rest gives clarity. Solitude gives perspective. Sabbath gives healing. And if I'm honest, I didn't know how much I needed healing until I finally slowed down long enough for God to speak. During that sabbatical, God didn't just rest my body, He reset my soul. He reminded me that He loves me for who I am, not what I do. He reminded me that the church belongs to Him, not me. He reminded me that he is the provider, the shepherd, the builder, not me. And that revelation alone made the entire sabbatical worth it. Why this chapter exists. This chapter is not just about time off. This is not about vacations or lazy days. This is about holy rhythms. This is about spiritual survival. This is about aligning your life with God's design. My prayer for every man who reads this chapter is simple. May you learn to rest before you break. May you draw away before you burn out. May you discover God in the stillness before the storm ever comes. Because sabbatical and solitude aren't escapes, they are encounters. They aren't pauses. They are preparation. They aren't weakness. They are wisdom. And they will make you a stronger, healthier, more godly man than you ever imagined. Solitude is where we hear God. There are moments in a man's life when the noise around him becomes so constant, so familiar, that he forgets what silence even sounds like. I know that feeling well. For years I lived at a pace that never really allowed me to slow down long enough to hear my own thoughts, let alone the voice of God. I thought that movement equaled progress and that productivity equaled spiritual strength. It wasn't until much later that I realized how many divine conversations I had missed simply because I never sat still long enough to listen. Solitude was something I admired in the Bible but avoided in my own life, and it took years for me to understand that solitude isn't something God suggests. Solitude is something God uses. When I look at the life of Elijah in 1 Kings 19, I'm reminded of how similar we are to that prophet who had grown weary under the weight of expectations and fear. Elijah had seen God's power in dramatic ways. Fire falling from heaven, miracles in dire situations, confrontations with evil that would make most men run. Yet even a man like Elijah reached a breaking point. After a single threat from Jezebel, he fled into the wilderness, exhausted and overwhelmed. The Bible tells us that God sent wind, an earthquake, and fire, but his voice wasn't in any of those. Instead, Elijah heard a still small voice. That detail has always struck me. God didn't shout, he whispered. And whispers are reserved for those who are close enough to hear them. That's the beauty of solitude. It doesn't push us toward God. Solitude draws us close enough to hear him whisper. Elijah didn't encounter the whisper while running, preaching, or performing. He heard God only after the noise around him had been stripped away. It was in the quiet and the stillness of that cave that the voice of God finally broke through his fear and exhaustion. And I often wonder how many times God has whispered to me, moments when he tried to speak comfort, direction, correction, or encouragement. But I missed it because my mind was too crowded and my schedule too full. I've had seasons where silence made me uncomfortable. The truth is, silence has a way of revealing what noise conveniently hides. When you sit alone long enough, you start noticing the things you've ignored, your thoughts, your emotions, your disappointments, and the places where your soul needs healing. Many men avoid solitude for that exact reason. It's easier to drown out what we're feeling with activity. It's easier to stay busy, to keep moving, to keep working, than to sit alone with God and let him begin addressing the things we've buried. Solitude isn't scary because of the quiet. Solitude is scary because of the truth the quiet reveals. I remember a moment years ago when I pulled into a Walmart parking lot after a long day. I didn't even know why I stopped the car. I just felt heavy. Nothing was technically wrong, but everything felt off. Instead of rushing inside, I turned off the engine and sat quietly. In that stillness, with no music or conversations to distract me, I whispered, "Lord, what's happening to me?" The answer came quickly, not audibly, but unmistakably. "You're carrying things I never asked you to carry." That simple sentence broke something open in me. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back suddenly came pouring out. I realized that exhaustion isn't always physical. Sometimes it's emotional and spiritual. That weight I felt wasn't from God. It was from my own attempts to control things I was never meant to control. That moment taught me something profound. Solitude exposes what busyness tries to hide. And God will often wait for us to become quiet enough before he speaks the things our hearts desperately need to hear. When I look at Jesus' life, I see the same pattern of solitude. Luke 6:12 says, "He went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God." Before Jesus made major decisions, he withdrew. Before he faced pressure, he withdrew. Before miracles, he withdrew. Even as crowds pressed around him, eager for his attention and hungry for his power, he often stepped away. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that ministry without solitude quickly becomes ministry without power. Jesus wasn't running away from responsibility. He was running toward the Father. His strength came from the stillness. His clarity came from the quiet. His peace came from solitude. And if the Son of God himself needed solitude to navigate the demands of his calling, then surely every man, regardless of stage, position, or title, needs the same. I've come to understand that solitude isn't an escape. It's an appointment. It's not avoiding your responsibilities. It's preparing your spirit so you can carry them without collapsing under the weight. Jesus didn't withdraw out of weakness. He withdrew out of wisdom. And the more I walk with God, the more I realize that wisdom often begins in silence. There were times in my life when I avoided solitude because I feared what I might discover in it. When you're constantly moving, it's easy to ignore the cracks in your foundation. But stillness exposes your true condition. Solitude reveals where you're hurting, where you're tired, where you're pretending, and where you're drifting spiritually. God doesn't bring these things up to shame us. He brings them up to heal us. But healing can't come if we never slow down long enough for him to work. I've watched this play out in my own life more times than I can count. When I'm not spending time alone with God, I become more irritable, more reactive, more anxious, and more unsure of myself. My discernment gets cloudy, my decisions become more emotional, my thoughts feel scattered, but when I draw away, when I quiet the noise and sit with God, I gain clarity I didn't even know I needed. Problems look smaller. Fears lose their intensity. Stress becomes manageable, and somehow, in solitude, God restores what life has drained. The truth is, solitude is often where God realigns our priorities. When everything is loud, it's easy to mistake urgency for importance. But solitude reminds us what truly matters. It reminds us that we're sons before we're servants, that we're loved before we're leaders, and that we're human before we're pastors, husbands, or fathers. Solitude is God's way of whispering, "Come back to me, sit with me. Let's talk about what's happening in your heart." I've had moments in solitude where God encouraged me at just the right time, moments where he corrected my attitude, moments where he reminded me he was still in control, and moments where I felt his love in a way that settled every fear. These moments didn't happen on stage or in a meeting or during a sermon. They happened alone, quiet, unhurried. They happened when I stepped away from the noise and allowed God to reconnect what life had disconnected. One of the most overlooked truths about solitude is that it protects us from ourselves. We all have blind spots, insecurities, frustrations, and weaknesses. If we don't deal with them privately, they eventually show up publicly. Solitude gives God access to the parts of us we hide from everyone else. And when God has access, he brings healing, strength, and clarity we didn't even know we needed. Every man needs a place of solitude, a chair, a corner, a trail, a room, a car ride, something. Not because solitude is trendy or spiritual sounding, but because solitude is where God meets us with what we need most. He meets us with rest. He meets us with renewal. He meets us with wisdom. He meets us with strength. And most importantly, he meets us with himself. If there's one thing I could encourage every man to practice consistently, it's this. Create space for God. Not hurried, not rushed, not squeezed in between tasks. Real space. Quiet space. The kind of space where your soul can finally breathe and your spirit can finally hear again. Because in that space, you will find what Elijah found, God's whisper. And that whisper will guide you, correct you, strengthen you, and calm you in ways nothing else can. Solitude is not loneliness. It's invitation. It's God saying, "Come away with me. Let me strengthen you before you go back to the noise." In the world we live in, loud, demanding, overconnected, overstimulated, solitude has become more than a spiritual discipline. It has become a lifeline. When a man learns solitude, he learns God. When he learns God, he learns himself. When he learns himself, he becomes the man God intended him to be. Sabbath is trusting God to work while we rest. I've come to believe that one of the hardest things for a man to do is stop. Not slow down, not reduce his speed, not take a quick breather, but truly stop. To pause the striving, to lay down the responsibilities, to step away from the pressure and the deadlines and the expectations. Men don't like to stop because stopping feels like losing control. It feels like falling behind. It feels like weakness. For many of us, rest is harder than work because rest forces us to trust God in ways busyness never will. Sabbath is one of the most misunderstood and neglected spiritual disciplines in the life of modern men. We think of Sabbath as a religious tradition, a cultural relic, or a ceremonial custom that no longer applies to our fast-paced lives. But the truth is, Sabbath is not about a specific day. It's about a posture of the heart. It is a rhythm God built into creation itself, a divine invitation to stop working long enough to remember who the real provider is. When God gave the Ten Commandments, He didn't mumble the one about the Sabbath. He didn't make it a suggestion or a footnote. He placed it right alongside commands about murder, adultery, idolatry, and lying. Exodus 28:10 says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In it you shall do no work." I used to wonder why God made such a big deal about rest. Why would the God who can do anything command His people to stop and do nothing for an entire day? It didn't make sense to me until I realized that Sabbath is not about inactivity. Sabbath is about trust. It's about believing that God can handle what I cannot, and that He can keep the world spinning without my hands on it. The language God uses in Exodus is intentional. Remember the Sabbath. That word remember suggests something deeper, something our human nature tends to forget. We forget that God, not us, is our provider. We forget that our identity is not tied to our productivity. We forget that rest is part of God's design for our well-being, not a luxury reserved for vacations. When God tells us to keep the Sabbath, He's not demanding obedience for His sake. He's protecting us for ours. I remember the first time I tried to genuinely honor a Sabbath. Not a casual day off, not a half-hearted break, not a rest day where I still checked emails and texted leaders, but an actual Sabbath. I woke up that morning feeling guilty for not working. I kept checking the time, thinking about everything I should be doing. My mind kept racing, looking for something to fix, something to plan, something to produce. It was embarrassing how difficult it was for me to sit still. I realized in that moment that the real battle was not between me and my schedule. It was between me and my trust. That morning, I sat outside with my Bible open, but my heart was tense. I wasn't resting. I was worrying. And worry, I've learned, is fake work. Worry makes you feel like you're accomplishing something when you're actually just draining yourself. So I prayed, "Lord, teach me to rest." And the sense I felt in my heart was this: rest is not the absence of responsibility. Rest is the presence of God's faithfulness. The more I sat there, the more I became aware of how much of my life I had spent trying to hold everything together. As a husband, a father, a pastor, and a provider, I felt responsible for so much. And it wasn't that God was telling me those roles were unimportant. He was simply showing me that I was never meant to carry them alone. Sabbath is the reminder that God carries what we can't. One of the most powerful passages on rest is found in Hebrews 4:9-11. "There remains a rest for the people of God. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest." That phrase has always amazed me. Strive to enter rest. It sounds contradictory at first. Why strive to do something that sounds passive? But when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Rest takes effort because everything in our nature fights against it. Sabbath is not automatic. It is intentional. It is a discipline. It is a choice. And it is often a battle. There is a reason the scripture uses the word strive. Because rest is more spiritual than physical. It is more about surrender than stillness. Entering God's rest means laying down the illusion that we are our own source. It means releasing control. It means believing that God is working even when we aren't. It means trusting that what we place in His hands doesn't fall apart. It flourishes. I've learned this through experience. When my wife and I took our sabbatical, I didn't realize how much of my identity was tied up in my role. Not being at church felt wrong. Not preparing sermons felt uncomfortable. And not being present made me feel disconnected and anxious. Part of me worried the church wouldn't survive without me. Another part worried that I wouldn't survive without the church. But God used that time away to reveal something I had never fully acknowledged. Sabbath exposes whether we trust God or we trust ourselves. I can honestly say that the first couple of weeks of my sabbatical were brutal. My mind kept drifting to responsibilities. I felt guilty for resting. I worried about things going wrong. I even found myself watching the live stream of our services like some undercover pastor trying to supervise from a distance, until my wife lovingly corrected me. If you are watching, you're not resting. She was right, even though I didn't want to admit it. Rest isn't rest if you're still trying to manage everything. Slowly, I started letting go. I started breathing again. I started feeling human again. And somewhere in that journey, I realized how desperately my spirit needed that pause. Ministry can become so demanding that you forget to simply be with God, not as a pastor, a leader, or a preacher, but as a son. Sabbath brings you back to that place. It reminds you that before you ever did anything for God, you belong to Him. One particular day, I remember waking up with no agenda, no sermon to write, no meeting to attend, no obligation pulling me in multiple directions. I walked outside and just sat in silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing. My heart felt lighter, my thoughts felt clearer. And in that quiet moment, I sensed God whisper, "This is what I've wanted for you." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably Him. Sabbath creates space for God to speak what our busyness drowns out. I think many men are uncomfortable with Sabbath because Sabbath forces us to trust. When we work, we feel in control. When we rest, we are reminded that God is. Rest is a declaration of faith. When you rest, you declare, God can handle what I cannot. God is working even when I'm not. God is faithful even when I'm sleeping. Rest is not a sign of laziness. It is a sign of trust. One of the most beautiful parts of the Sabbath principle is that it existed before the law. God rested on the seventh day of creation, not because He was tired, but because He was showing us a pattern. God was teaching us that rest is part of our design. If the Creator of the universe took a day to enjoy His work, how much more should we? It took me years to understand that Sabbath is not a day for recovery. It is a day for renewal. Recovery means you barely made it. Renewal means you are being restored. Sabbath is God's way of keeping you whole so that you don't break. It's the rhythm that keeps your life from falling out of sync. It's the space where your soul catches up to your schedule. It's the breath you take before life demands more from you. Some of the greatest decisions I've ever made were birthed in rest. Clarity comes when the noise quiets. Wisdom comes when the heart slows. Strength comes when the body and spirit are refreshed. When I rest, I am more present with my family. When I rest, I hear God clearer. When I rest, my leadership becomes healthier. When I rest, my decisions are grounded. Sabbath doesn't weaken a man, Sabbath strengthens him. And then I often think about how many men are running on fumes, convinced that this level of exhaustion is normal. It's not. That's why God commands Sabbath. Not to restrict us, but to protect us. Not to limit our productivity, but to preserve our longevity. The man who Sabbaths is not the man who stops caring. He is the man who plans on finishing well. Sabbath is not about losing time. It's about gaining perspective. It's not about stepping away from responsibility. It's about stepping into God's presence. It's not about laziness. It's about alignment. And when you honor Sabbath, you begin to experience something powerful. The peace that comes from knowing God is in control, not you. When a man embraces Sabbath, he becomes stronger. His mind becomes clearer. His emotions become calmer. His spirit becomes steadier. And his heart becomes anchored again in the God who never stops working. Rest is a weapon against burnout. There's a kind of tired that sleep can't fix. Every man eventually learns this. It's the tired that comes from giving more than you have, the tired that comes from being strong for too long, the tired that comes from pretending you're fine when inside you're running on fumes. Eventually, every man reaches a moment when he realizes that burnout isn't just physical exhaustion. It's emotional, mental, spiritual depletion. And rest, real rest, becomes more than a luxury. It becomes a necessity for survival. Burnout doesn't hit suddenly. It creeps in quietly. It begins with neglecting small things: rest, joy, prayer, connection. Then slowly you start losing passion. The things you used to love feel like obligations. What once brought joy now feels like weight. You smile on the outside while your soul whispers, "I'm tired." But the most dangerous part of burnout is not the exhaustion. It's the belief that you can push through it. Most men don't crash because they're weak. They crash because they overloaded themselves and never saw the warning signs. This is why Jesus' words in Matthew 11:28 to 30 feel like cold water to a thirsty soul. He says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus doesn't say try harder. He doesn't say push through. He doesn't say be stronger. He says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." Notice something. Jesus doesn't offer a nap. He doesn't offer a day off. He offers himself. Rest is not just physical. Rest is relational. Rest is found in his presence. Rest is the result of exchange. Your burden for his, your pace for his, your strength for his. Burnout happens when we carry things God never designed us to carry. Rest comes when we let him carry what we can't. I remember a season when burnout was slowly swallowing me whole. Ministry was moving fast, demands were growing, and the weight of people's expectations was pressing heavily on my shoulders. At first, I didn't notice it. I pushed harder, convinced that if I just worked more, prayed more, planned more, I could outrun the fatigue. But burnout isn't something you outrun, it's something you crash into. One night, I came home after a long day. My wife was in the kitchen, and I remember her looking at me with concern. "You're not okay," she said, and I did what most men do. I insisted I was fine. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to pray. I didn't want to be around anyone. Everything felt heavy. I had reached that point where even small responsibilities felt overwhelming. It wasn't until I finally slowed down, really slowed down, that I realized how drained I was. I wasn't just tired, I was empty. And emptiness is dangerous for a man. When a man's soul is empty, everything around him starts to feel heavier. His marriage feels heavier, his calling feels heavier, his responsibilities feel heavier. Even his walk with God feels heavier. Burnout magnifies everything because burnout shrinks the soul. That season forced me to take rest seriously, not as weakness, but as warfare. I had to learn that rest is not the enemy of productivity. Rest is what makes productivity sustainable. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light," he wasn't saying life would be effortless. He was saying, walk at my pace. Burnout is often the result of walking at a pace God never asked you to walk. I began to see rest not as an escape, but as a strategy. Rest recharges the parts of you that life depletes. Rest clears the fog in your mind so you can see God's direction. Rest heals the wounds you never slowed down long enough to treat. Rest restores your joy. Rest resets your perspective. Rest re-anchors your identity. Rest makes you stronger than striving ever will. This is why Psalm 23, 2-3 is so powerful. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. I used to think the phrase, "he makes me lie down," sounded forceful, almost like God was pushing the sheep to the ground. But the more I reflected on it, the more I understood the imagery. Sheep don't lie down easily. They're anxious, easily disturbed, and restless by nature. They only lie down when the shepherd has made them feel completely secure. Sometimes God lets us hit the wall because it's the only way to make us lie down, not to punish us, but to restore us. Burnout is often the sign that we've been trying to shepherd ourselves. Rest is the reminder that we were never meant to. There was a moment during my sabbatical when this truth became painfully clear. I had been pushing myself for years through ministry, through difficult seasons, through personal storms, without giving myself permission to slow down. I thought rest was something I had to earn. I thought rest was something that came after the work was done. But rest is not the reward for finishing. Rest is the strength to continue. During those 2 months away, I felt the reality of Psalm 23 in a way I never had before. God didn't restore me through activities or achievements. He restored me through stillness, through silence, through long days of nothing but somehow everything, through moments where I wasn't Pastor Maurice, leader, problem solver, vision carrier, or counselor. I was just Maurice, a son who needed his father. I remember sitting on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, without an agenda. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt my soul breathe. Not my lungs, my soul. The part of me that gets bruised when people misunderstand me. The part of me that gets tired when I'm pulled in every direction. The part of me that gets anxious when the pressures pile up. The part of me that sometimes feels alone even in a room full of people. That part began to breathe again. Rest is more than sleep. Rest is soul care. And soul care is not selfish. It's stewardship. A burnt-out man cannot pour into his wife. A burnt-out father cannot pour into his children. A burnt-out leader cannot pour into his church. A burnt-out believer cannot hear from God with clarity. When your soul is empty, everything you touch begins to feel the emptiness. That's why rest is warfare. It protects what matters most. I've learned something else about burnout. Burnout grows in silence when men refuse to admit they need help. So many men believe asking for rest means failing, but Jesus never said, "Come to me when you've got it all together." He said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden." Rest is not for the strong. Rest is how God makes us strong. There are seasons when God uses rest to prepare us, seasons when He uses rest to heal us, and seasons when He uses rest to protect us. Sometimes the most spiritual thing a man can do is stop. Stop striving, stop pushing, stop forcing, stop performing, and simply let God restore him. Sometimes the weapon God gives you is not a sword. Sometimes it's a pillow. Sometimes it's not a battle plan. It's a quiet morning. Sometimes it's not a breakthrough moment. It's a deep breath. In the world we live in, where speed is celebrated and exhaustion is applauded, choosing rest is countercultural, but it is also deeply spiritual. When a man rests, he declares, "God is still working even when I am not." And that declaration is powerful. Rest is faith. Rest is humility. Rest is warfare. Burnout is not a badge of honor. Burnout is a sign that something needs to change. And rest is God's antidote. Rest resets the spirit. Rest restores joy. Rest revives courage. Rest refocuses your mind on what truly matters. Rest reminds you of who God is and who you are not. If I could tell every man reading this one thing, it would be this: don't wait until your soul collapses. Rest now before burnout becomes your breaking point. God didn't design you to run until you fall apart. He designed you to walk with Him, not ahead of Him. And when you walk with Him, His burden really is light. His yoke really is easy. His rest really does restore. Rest is not quitting. Rest is strengthening. Rest is not weakness. Rest is wisdom. Rest is not escape. Rest is equipping. And the man who learns to rest becomes the man who endures.